I see 1 o'clock on my clock, so I think that means it's go time. Um, so hi everyone who's tuning in. We cannot see you, but you can see us, which is a different Zoom dynamic than I've been in before. So I'm assuming you're out there and you're watching, and we're glad to have you with us. My name is Karim, and I'm the co-founder of Mask Out Hate, and I'm going to be facilitating this conversation today. But before we jump into the dialogue, I want to give you a little bit of background on what Mask Out Hate is, if you're not already familiar. So we're a community-centered design activism project that started last year as the pandemic reality was just beginning to sink in. And we organized a series of virtual, culturally specific community workshops in which Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian folks came together to brainstorm mask designs that could respond to the increased racism experienced by our communities during the pandemic, and the 2020 uprising for social justice. And through these workshops, our goal was to create income generating opportunities for artists and designers of color within our communities, to facilitate workshop sessions and translate ideas generated by community participants into finished designs for masks. And that's a high level overview. There's a lot more information up on the Mask Out Hate website, as well as the event page for this particular conversation. And you're going to hear a lot more as we dive into our conversation too. But there is one thing that I would like to take a moment to acknowledge before we move forward with that. I'd like to take a moment to honor the lives lost, stolen in last week's horrific massacre in Atlanta, in which 8 people were killed, 6 of them Asian women. The misogynistic white supremacist system that enabled the murders of Soon Chong Park, Hyun Jong Grant, Soon Cha Kim, Yang A Yui, Xiao Ji Tan, Dao Yu Feng, Delana Ashley Yan, and Paul Andre Michaels is the same white supremacist system that allows police and vigilantes to get away with murdering Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Quantas Hayes, and far too many others. This is the system that we are all fighting against through Mask Out Hate and in our daily lives as people of color in America. It is traumatizing and exhausting. And so for the next minute, I would like to invite everyone to share in a moment of silence, remembrance, and solidarity with our Asian American and Pacific Islander siblings. And folks are welcome to turn their cameras off if they would like to, and we will resume at 1:05. Thank you. So, as we were preparing for this conversation, the events of the last week had not yet transpired, and we will be holding space for whatever comes up in this conversation. Just want to note that. But with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to share a little bit about themselves, who they are, what motivates them in their life and their work, and the roles that they played in the Mask Out Hate Project. And I'm going to go in the order of people appearing on my screen, because that always keeps things exciting. And start with Wendy. So Wendy, take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy YuLing, she, her. I am a Chinese, Filipino, Dutch, and Scottish artist. And I do a lot of different stuff. I do printmaking, sell t-shirts, bandanas, lots of different things within my activism. And I also make a lot of costumes. And with those costumes, I explore identity and perception, how people perceive me and how I perceive myself and how I perceive others within those costumes that I create for myself. So this project made a lot of sense for me when I was approached about this and heard about it, because that's what we were doing, is exploring how do we feel when we're masked, and how do other people perceive us, and just us as people, even without the mask, and can we change that perception in some way?
Thank you. Yeah, and if you haven't checked out Wendy's work, and everyone who is part of this project, bios and links are on the website as well. It's really incredible. Up next on my screen is Kayin. So Kayin, would you like to introduce yourself and share what motivates you and what you do?
Good afternoon. My name is Kayin Talton Davis, she, her, and I am a visual artist. I use a lot of different mediums. Right now it's primarily digital, but most of my work is grounded in celebrating Black cultural aspects, and looking at it more of as a worldwide kind of what the similarities are and where those can be celebrated. And that really kind of started from my wish to give voice in a positive way and put forth a positive message to a community that is often in mainstream, just kind of like not talked about, and mostly negative images and messages put out. And so just kind of being in that space, it was amazing to be able to be invited to doing Mask Out Hate, which to me just perfectly aligned with a lot of the things that I want to do, which is just kind of reframing the message, reframing how people feel in spaces, and giving them voice to express themselves.
Thank you. It's so hard not to just jump into the conversations with everyone after you describe what you do. Sophia, you're up next on my screen. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Sophia. I'm the other founder of Mask Out Hate. I'm a first generation Taiwanese American, and I grew up in a really white part of town in Pennsylvania, and still am now in Portland. But I grew up very confused about my identity and just feeling like I was switching between countries growing up and experiencing the misunderstandings and confusion of that. So that's really driven my desire to create spaces of belonging, which are so essential to many communities who feel the pain of living in a world that doesn't value their lives and doesn't value their ways of knowing. the work I do is as a spatial artist and an architect. We all spend the majority of our time in built environments. And so just recognizing how those can positively impact how people live, what it's possible for them to imagine, how people are able to project themselves in the world, like all the things Wendy mentioned. I think of clothing and masks as this form of shelter at the scale of the body. So for me, masks in this project are architecture, they are space, and they inform our lives at the very smallest scale.
Thank you, Sophia. Yeah, physically small, but also really significant, especially in this time of the pandemic. Well, last but not least on my screen is Kulsum. Kulsum, would you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Karim. Hi, everybody. My name is Kulsoom Shah, pronouns she, they. I migrated to the US from Pakistan in 2002, and I am currently living here in Salem, Oregon. And at this stage of my life, I practice Chinese medicine, and I'm really driven to assist my clients in helping find safety, resilience, and empowerment within their own beings. And we do that through different mind-body practices. And that's really what drove me to become a part of this project, because I was interested in, for myself also, just the experience of wearing a mask and finding out how to wear a mask while dealing with whatever anxiety that brought up. And so I was really interested in helping participants find ease in their body by connecting to their breath, and also offering mind-body practices to help people anchor into the present moment as we were going to go into creating art and also addressing topics that were potentially charged.
Thank you, Kulsum. And I'll note that your participation wasn't necessarily something that factored into the initial ideation of this project. It kind of emerged out of conversations with artists as we were brainstorming. And so I think that's a really good segue to the first question that we're going to talk about, which is going to be directed at Sophia. This project started as a desire to meet a specific need for BIPOC during the pandemic. And I'd like you to share a little bit more about what your original vision was and how it changed or evolved over the last year of Mask Out Hate.
Yeah, so when this project started, there were really three intersecting motivations. One, which I'm really feeling this week, is racial profiling, and just having friends who were going out and being put in danger when they were just getting groceries, Black and brown people being told to take their masks off to prove their identities when they're just going to buy food. Asians being perceived as disease or otherwise risky to people in this country, and just wondering if masks could be designed that addressed or highlighted the inequity aggravated by mask wearing at that time. Masks were still sort of a new thing. People weren't used to seeing them on people. I think a second motivation was feeling like people of color were being forgotten in a lot of the volunteer efforts and things in play to create masks. And as we've seen, people of color have disproportionately died from COVID due to the racist structures that impact our communities, access to healthcare, the inability to stay home. So I felt like someone needed to be thinking about that and doing something. And then the third, Karim mentioned, just wanting to create income for artists and businesses, definitely seeing the loss of commissions for many of the artists around me and wanting to provide a way for income generation while also kind of having these necessary conversations. One thing that really changed, I think, from what I initially thought the project was, I actually thought this project would be more cheeky. And, you know, there were statements out, you've maybe seen some masks that say like hate is a virus and have very strong statements that are like fighting and like against the system. What I learned in this project, and it's sort of what Kayin was talking about, like there's such a need for healing and wholeness and joy, and you know what people were really looking for in their time together and in the mask designs was a celebration of identity. And I thought that was really beautiful, how that came out. I also learned that there's a really big need for these spaces of joy and healing and celebration. We asked our participants for feedback after workshops, and the consistent feedback we got from the majority of our participants was that they wanted more. They wanted more time together, they wanted more sessions. So at this point, I think we're really looking for our experience and our network to be an inspiration and a resource to others, to create spaces for the creative conversations and co-creating wherever those conversations are needed. And it's one of the drivers of wanting to have this event today, to actually share this project out. And it doesn't have to be mask making. The need for masks will pass, and but these spaces will still be important.
I absolutely hope the need for masks will pass. Although I'm still going to wear the mask, my Mask Out Hate mask proudly. But I think that's a great segue into the next question. You know, in terms of doing more of this, in terms of what it took to make these workshops happen and how they functioned during the time of COVID. You know, we were not able to meet in person. All of these workshops took place virtually. We met, I met most of the people on this call virtually over the last year. And it can be really hard to build trust and to build rapport during an event where you're creating with other people, especially if you've never met them before, with this kind of physical distancing. But at the same time, we absolutely would not have been doing this project in this way. We probably wouldn't have come together if it hadn't been for COVID and the circumstances of this pandemic. So I'd like to ask the panelists what you would do differently if you weren't constrained by physical distancing on this project. And Wendy, since you're still first on my screen, I'm going to throw it to you first, but I will switch it up. Don't worry.
I just really value being able to be in space with people. There's really something to be said for feeling the vibe of a room, feeling the vibe of all the people around you, being able to switch things up a little bit if it feels like something just isn't resonating, and you can't really go off the cuff like that when you're not in front of people. So I would just really have loved to be in that space so we could spread out and actually have maybe different colors that we could be looking at together to talk about emotions and how we associate with color, and different tools for making that we could have all been sharing. Because I think sharing is really important, just that feeling of, oh, do you have the glue? Yeah, pass it over, and that kind of thing that we really didn't get to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember when we had kind of the prep conversation for this conversation, that idea of color came up for you really strongly. And being able to gauge people's responses in that dynamic way. And Kulsum, I'm going to ask you next, like if you were doing this kind of project again, running these workshops again, and we weren't constrained physically, what would you do differently?
Yes, my response is somewhat similar because the work that I do really also involves reading the room and getting non-verbal feedback from people to get a sense of how to lead the practice. And because of the need to be in front of a screen, the practices that I led ultimately became more about breath and not so much about physical movement. And if we were actually in a physical space to move around and not limited to a little box, then I would do more body movement exercises, more qigong perhaps, and just actually venting the energy through the body instead of using the breath. Although the breath is really powerful as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly say that even with just the virtual presence of your practice, I've learned a lot and carried it into other spaces that I work on virtually and physically. I still shake things out before a big Zoom call that I'm anxious about. Kayin, how would you do things differently if we were in person?
I think Wendy and Kulsum have said a lot of the same things that I would say. It's really kind of difficult when you're sitting in front of a computer. It feels like you're just speaking things out, and if people don't have their cameras on, you don't know what's going on the other side. And so it is really kind of hard to judge the level of participation that's going on, the vibe, as Wendy mentioned. And so if I were to do it in person, it would definitely be perhaps a little bit more one-on-one time, depending on how many participants, and really just kind of get a feel for what was going on in that space, what was the energy of not only the participants, but just where everybody was that day.
So from that, I'm going to stay with you, Kane, for this next question because it ties in. Let's say we continue to be in a world where we need to be distanced at least part of the time. If you were going to do this again and it needed to be remote, we had to do some sort of workshop that didn't allow people to come together in physical space. Is there anything that you would adjust or shift in the process that we undertook to make it more connective, to overcome some of those obstacles that you experienced?
I think the biggest thing I would do would extend the time, even if it were the same amount of time, just broken into 2 sections to give people a chance to really think and get into what they were doing. I think that would probably be the biggest change that I would make. In our workshop, we worked and then we put on some work music. And so there was that kind of breakup, but it was like 5 minutes versus a day of being able to think about it and do things at your leisure. So yeah, that would be probably the biggest thing that I would adjust if possible.
And I do remember, as Sophia mentioned at the beginning, like that was something that came out from participants as well. Like, we'd love to do this again. We'd love to do another one of these.
Yeah.
I'm curious, Wendy or Kulsum, in reflecting, along with having more time or breaking the sessions out into multiple sessions, anything else that comes to mind for you of how we could do this differently in a virtual setting? And I realize I said both of your names and not just one person. So Wendy, I'm going to throw it to you first.
I mean, honestly, I don't think that it would be something like, the time is huge. I'm not a person who participates right during a workshop either. So it's nice when it's broken up because I'll go back into my safe space and make the thing and reflect, and then come back and have more to contribute. But yeah, I would be interested in doing another thing like this virtually, only because I wasn't super familiar with Zoom at the time I did it for the first time. So it felt like I was probably missing some things just in terms of managing the screen and figuring out the chat and that kind of thing. But I did actually kind of like having the ability to have people speaking, but then other people in the chat at the same time. I think that there is some way to get a lot of really rich feedback. But it's just a matter of knowing the process and being able to do that once you know the process.
Yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about the experience of the workshop that I participated in, which was for folks from Southwest Asian, North African communities, and how significantly participation like shifted when the facilitators, Sarah, Farahat, and Mohammed, ended up asking people directly for their feedback or to participate, more of an individual invitation to contribute, which is something that may not be quite as necessary when you're in a physical space together. But when no one knows who should talk first, it makes it hard, and I think people don't want to step on each other. Kulsum, what about you? I mean, you talked about breath work. Is there anything else that you think would be, that you would try to do differently if we were doing it virtually again?
Yeah, in terms of the practices that offered, I think that it might be possible to weave in some moving practices, especially if there's more time or if it's broken up, so that there is an opportunity to have an additional practice session. But also, I think it would be really helpful to have more feedback from the participants in terms of their experience with regards to the mind-body practices, to help get a better sense of what would be most useful for the participants in future workshops.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Post-workshop feedback to build on for the next one, which I do want to note, your role was unique, quite unique in that you actually participated in multiple workshops as the mind-body practice facilitator. So I feel like every time we met with you, you were like reflecting on the last workshop and saying like, oh, I'm going to try this, or, oh, this really resonated with people. But taking the burden off of you or one in your role to be that point of feedback seems like it would be helpful. So the next question that I would like to get folks thinking on and responding to is how these workshops and your experience with them inform the work that you do. If it does inform the work that you do moving forward, is there anything that you will take with you from this project into your art practice or your somatic practices, architectural practices? And does anyone want to go first? After a year of Zoom, I should know better than to ask that question. Kulsum, wow, hand raised, go for it.
I'll go first because it kind of weaves into what we just talked about. It wasn't really a burden, to be honest. I think it was really lovely to be able to go from each different session. And what shifted for me during that is what shifted for me in my own work also, is that oftentimes I have an idea of what is needed. Like for the very first session, I practiced with you all, and we did the activity that I practiced with you all. But in the next workshop that I went into, I thought that that's what I would do. But as I was participating in the workshop, it became very clear to me at the very end that that particular group needed something completely different. And so we made up a meditation practice on spot for them. And the same thing happened with the next workshop. And so I learned to become really fluid with the needs of the group. And I've discovered that in my own practice as well with my own clients, is that I can always have an idea of what I think that they need, But if I'm really listening, deep listening and paying attention, then what is needed will reveal itself to me and I can create something that's more supportive.
That is beautiful. Okay, well, Sophia, how about you? How has your practice been informed by this project, this process?
I think there are two things. One is just recognizing the power of collective action and bringing like-minded people together. I think I have in the past operated just as a person, pushing things as much as I can, and sometimes having a tendency not to act because some things just felt too big or much bigger than myself. And this project really helped me to gain comfort in saying hey, do you want to do this together? And is this meaningful, or what would be meaningful? So just kind of proved to me that there's awesome people out there, and the things that can't be done by one person can be done with others. And this year I was reading a writing by Tima Akun, where she talks about white supremacy culture and individualism being one characteristic of that. And so for me, it feels really good to throw those expectations away, because I think we can do a lot more without just individual effort and individual ego. There is taking into my work as an architect. Well, there is that aspect that I just mentioned, but also we work a lot with communities in conversation for architecture, gathering people for community engagement events, where usually we're just posing questions verbally and kind of having a verbal conversation. And something I really learned from these workshops was how much imagination and joy and community building comes from actually having tools in your hand and being able to draw together and imagine together. So I'm finding myself wanting to find ways for community engagement in my architecture work to really be a space of building community and a space of being in community together.
Yeah, when we talk about community engagement, more of the emphasis tends to land on engagement, and it does, as someone who shares the architectural world with Sophia, yeah, I can definitely say it feels like a lot of the time the facilitator of the process is an outsider and comes in from that perspective. And I think that extends to a lot of design professions. We're coming in to gather input and then going off and doing our thing, and not necessarily rooting ourselves in the communities that we are ostensibly serving. But that's an editorial. Kane, I would like to throw that same question to you. How have you grown, or what has your practice been influenced by in this process?
Some of what you actually just said, being in a field of design and doing a lot more community engagement more recently than I had in the past. Just really kind of focusing on carrying through, again, that voice of the people that I'm working with, the voice of the community or the class participant, workshop participants that I'm working with, to make sure that it's a product of what they want to see, and really kind of guiding that in a way that makes it beneficial for all, and really kind of pulls in whatever skills that I have, whatever skills they have, to make it just a better project, and really just kind of pulling that more so into my practice, and even just kind of using some of the concepts and thoughts from our workshop that were presented, I think really have started to influence some of my work in other realms.
Yeah, Well, Wendy, the same question to you.
So a couple of things. One, everything that just got said. Being in community is amazing. Working with communities is amazing. And feeling like I've done justice to all of the concepts that were brought up during discussions and having, feedback. There was a bit of back and forth after the workshop that I led where, I would email different concepts and choices out to folks, and then they would get back to me. And that was really fun because I think it really felt to everybody. I hope it really felt to everybody who participated that they were continuing to be a part of that process. And what was finally put out to them was something that we all created together. And that felt really good. Of course, want more of that all the time. And yeah, for myself, I've noticed a shift within having to do with color, because I was very surprised while we explored color that people had very much different reactions than I thought when I would propose. So what happened was I would say, well, let's talk about blue. And when you think about blue, what emotion do you associate with that? And my assumption would be, I guess, like a certain range of emotions, but I got all kinds of emotions, things I absolutely didn't expect. Same for red, which I associate with certain things, but other people were just completely the opposite. And that makes me, of course, rethink when I'm messaging as an activist, when I'm creating messaging, how just to make sure that I guess the people who are central to that messaging, which are sometimes not me when I'm working with Indigenous communities, for instance, that I am in conversation with that community, making sure that these colors are a part of the message that they're trying to send. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about what came up a little earlier, how the need for more time or the desire for more time seems pretty strong, and how, maybe a typical or a traditional process includes one or two touch points with the people that we're designing for or with. And we bring so many assumptions to those that if we don't take the time to have that dialogue and get that repeated feedback, how much of the work that ends up being presented to the people that we're working with is based on our own assumptions, and how much richer could it be if we took the time that we needed and that the folks we're working with needed. Yeah. All right. Well, Kulsum, I'm going to ask you this next question, which is definitely related. But was there anything about this project, and it could be the process, it could be any aspect of it, that challenged you to think or grow in new ways, in unexpected ways? And I know you touched on that a little, but I want to open it up more directly to that question of being challenged.
Yeah, thank you. So as you mentioned at the beginning, I had a unique perspective because I got to participate in more than one workshop. And each workshop was targeted to a particular community. And I am just constantly amazed by how we experience resilience and trauma and recovery and joy based on our life experiences and our conditioning. And that really became apparent to me as we conducted these different workshops. And it was just really humbling, first of all, to be able to witness all of these different groups and to hold space, and also learn what tools of resilience are already available to people, and that perhaps they aren't languaged in the way that I'm accustomed to, but that doesn't mean that they're not already there. And so this really enabled me to see that and helps me bring it back to my work as I work with different populations and help people.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm gonna pass that question on to the other folks on this panel as well. Like, and I know growth doesn't necessarily have to come from being challenged, but it certainly seems to a lot of the time if we're open to it. So, Kayin, I'd like to hear from you. Just how were you challenged in this process?
I think my biggest challenge was making sure, for me personally, was really kind of making sure that I got across what the people in my workshop wanted to get across. There were so many different voices in there, but really just kind of melding that all together and making sure that it was like solid was really kind of not, it wasn't that, but it was difficult, but it was a challenge. Just because I wanted it to be everything without it being, too much. Or rather without it being confusing. I didn't want to bring any kind of confusion into that. So I think that was one of the biggest challenges for me. And then again, just kind of the being able to gauge what was going on. Because some people, weren't able to navigate Zoom as well as others. And so some of the voices were lost out, and just kind of jumping from the chat to speaking to email was, just some of the technical stuff, but things are going much smoother now.
Well, I am glad to hear that. And yeah, I think technology is definitely, I mean, we've all been learning how to use all these tools in ways that we, at least most of us, had not been using them prior. And it also poses a barrier to participation for so many people. I think, and I do want to stay on this topic of being challenged, but something that's coming up for me right now is the challenge of creating a safe space in this virtual setting where we are both addressing, pain, loss, hardship, struggle, and seeking to celebrate and elevate joy. So I'd like to put that question to Wendy on the topic of challenge, but yeah, how do you feel like, especially in light of maybe the events of this last week, where we're reminded of what prompted us to create this project in the first place? How do you feel like the challenge there between balancing joy and celebration and holding space for grief or collective remembrance or the heavy feelings played out or could play out?
Yeah, it might have maybe a slightly different perspective on that, because I am also a funeral celebrant, and which those two words even sounds really strange together, right? Funeral celebrant. But if you think about it in terms of, the speaker for the dead, you are sharing a whole life. Someone has passed, you're sharing a whole life, and a lot of that life is joy. And I think that it is joyful to create a space where we can talk about grief. I don't think that those two things are mutually exclusive at all, because there's joy in safety, and there's joy in release, and there's joy in community, even when that community is united by something that is less than optimal. So to the challenge question, I would say, it was challenging for me to work internally to figure out how much of the masking should be sort of a direct message to people who are viewing the person wearing the mask versus sort of a fortifier for the person who is wearing the mask. And so for my group, it turned out less of a challenge outward and more of like a talisman that a person can wear to give them confidence and inner strength and healing. Because I realized that in one mask, I love the masking concept, and I love all that we did within that. But that, I think, can be more powerful as a personal talisman than it can be as a mind changer to the observer. Because when you feel confident in this thing that you're wearing that is protecting you, and not just physically from disease, but also because of the intention that's put into it and that all of us put into it together, also gives confidence in that way and protection in that way, that can make such a big difference in just the way a person carries themselves and acts when they're out in the world. But that was hard to come to those conclusions. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm processing everything that you just said and thinking the psychological or spiritual or emotional power of wearing something that you feel protects you directly, right? It's not just a utilitarian tool. It's not just another mask. It's an extension of the things that you hold dear, the community that you're a part of. And it's a wish, right? Or a hope or a prayer for protection in the act of wearing it. So Sophia, I want to ask you the same question too. And as the founder of this project, who spent most of your time behind the scenes kind of orchestrating and facilitating the whole process, and even putting the masks in envelopes and hand delivering them to people or mailing them out, you played a different role. And I'm extremely grateful to the role that you played. How did you feel challenged in this project, or what felt challenging for you?
I think the biggest challenge was just the unexpectedness of so many things over the course of this project, and also needing to really balance different people's needs or expectations for how much the project would support them, or how much they various artists, for instance, like wanted to shape the project. I think, you know, part of it is just there's been a lot of exhaustion for some people, people of color, and just the emotional burden of this year, and needing to have that, leave that space for other people in this project, or like when there were fires, like that impacted this group. And so just needing to kind of shift gears and leave more space, and not, I think we've talked a lot about schedules, but like not just set a schedule and say like, okay, we're going to get this project done, and it, you know, doesn't matter what's happening in everyone's lives. There's an, so just needing to like kind of feel out the needs and make sure that this project was a space that was of wellness, and not further contributing to the trauma, or further contributing to the stress of this year. I think that was something I spent a lot of time thinking about. I also want to just like react to Wendy and talking about celebration in grief. I think that's interesting because, you know, right before we got on this call, I was talking about how I don't feel very celebratory today. You know, this event's supposed to celebrate Mask Out Hate, but I am finding it very hard to celebrate this week or find joy this week, because part of what I recognize is like the beauty of the the joy and spaces of connection we've created are only necessary because that cultural joy has been stripped away by white dominant culture. And so like I feel myself in like this conflict of, maybe it's the same conflict Wendy was talking about, like do we celebrate fortify ourselves, or do we like message out? Because the message out is still necessary. Like the responsibility for even needing these spaces lives kind of outside of our communities. So that's a conflict and that I'm feeling today.
Yeah, feeling that as well. And I wanted to segue into another topic or another question, which was, you know, what part of the process did people enjoy the most? But I do think, I mean, folks have talked about that a little bit and kind of shared bits and pieces of what felt really beautiful and meaningful. And I also want to maybe pause on what you just raised and how that connects to what Wendy raised. And ask the question, what could this experience turn into if it wasn't necessarily a response to a harmful dominant culture or a context that demands the creation of spaces where we, as communities of folks with marginalized identities, are there to support and reinforce each other and have to find a way to create joy for each other in these spaces. Like joy is a necessary component of our societies, regardless of what the context is, and celebration and grief and coming together. And it feels fundamentally unfair to feel like you need to do that in response to an oppressive system, right? So I know this wasn't in our pre-prepared questions, but I would like to put that question out there. If we weren't against racism, like if it wasn't about anti-something, but it was about building for us, for a future that is liberated, that is just, that is more free from fear of oppression or struggle. What would that look like? How would you do a workshop like this in that context? Can you conceive of it? Wendy, yes.
I've been in spaces like that, and the one in particular I'm thinking of, I actually learned so much there. In Waimanalo on Hawaii, it's the nation of Hawaii who are, there's a big Hawaiian sovereignty movement, and there are many different factions, but this is one faction and they actually have land. I was able to speak to the people who are leading there. And Bumpy Kanahele is the person who's been leading this movement the longest with the nation of Hawaii. And I asked him, this was a few years ago and I was already exhausted. And I asked him, how do you do it? How do you keep going? Because there's so many times that you've been knocked back in the past, and that can be really discouraging. And how do you keep up this energy? And he said, obviously this is totally paraphrasing, but he said, you're never, don't be anti something. When you're anti something, then once you achieve that and you overcome that and you've bested all of those things, then what are you? So don't form your identity around that. Instead, move forward with love. Everything that you do should be done from a core of love. So when I take that into the question that you just asked, how do we, what do those spaces look like? I think that like what they're doing in Waimanalo, we need to be creating these spaces for ourselves that are not in response. They just have nothing to do with what's going on out there. We're just doing our thing over here, and being kind to one another, and figuring out maybe ways outside of capitalism, and ways outside of settler colonialism, and we're figuring out how we all work best, so we are building a better future together. And it has nothing to do with you, and you're not invited. That's what I think of.
Thank you. Yeah. Kulsum, I want to throw that same question to you if you have any reflections. You look pensive.
Yeah, I do have some reflections. Might be a bit out there, but here goes. From the time that I've spent in my own cultivation, what I've discovered is that a lot of times what I fear and I think is outside of me, although there are things happening outside of me, the only thing that I can control is my response and how I experience things. And that's what I find to be really empowering through the mind-body practices, are tools to help regulate my nervous system, or tools to help actually interface with aspects within myself that are challenging, that come out in interaction with people. And I really appreciate what Wendy brought up, and turning the lens around and approaching things from a space of love. And I'm not saying like, the hippie love of like, yeah, everything's good, we're just gonna like bury our head in the sand. No, we don't bury our head in the sand, but we take self-responsibility, and that is empowering, I think. And I think that those are the kinds of spaces that we can create, and they have nothing to do with an oppressor or lack of. It just comes from an internal sovereignty.
I love that phrase. Yeah, definitely. Well, Kayin, do you have any reflections on that as well?
Yeah, just kind of thinking about spaces that are creating these spaces. The first thing that comes to mind is going to like a family cookout, right? It doesn't have anything to do about anybody else, but all you are there to do is to celebrate each other, to celebrate your family, to celebrate those connections. And these are spaces that unfortunately we've kind of lost in the last year because we're not able to socialize the same way. But those are the kind of spaces where we get fed, not only physically, but emotionally and spiritually. And I think creating more of those spaces, that kind of feeling, that kind of space where we're celebrating each other, celebrating because we're together, celebrating because we're on this, we're on this planet, celebrating because it's another day. That it's truly rooted in that love, it's truly rooted in that joy, it's rooted in that positivity. You're excited to go. People understand you, you have similar traditions and so on. And I think it's just really those kind of spaces that to me are the most exciting, to me are the most, you can go and you can talk all day, you can go to meetings all day and be absolutely exhausted at the end of the day. You can go to workshops and be exhausted. When you go to family functions, when you go to cultural functions, you might be tired at the end of it, but it's because it's a different kind of tired, I would venture to say. You've been filled, and it's a tired of being comfort, kind of like after you've eaten your fill after food, you get tired just so that your body can rest and really kind of absorb all those nutrients. And I would say that that's really what you kind of experience after that kind of a function, is just really digesting everything that you've learned, everything that you felt, all the good kind of energy that you've accumulated. And those are the spaces that I love to operate from.
Yeah, I love that, thinking about community and like communing with one another. It's not an engagement process when you're hanging out with your family or your friends, you know. It's nourishing and it's creative. Um, Sophia, do you have anything that you want to share on this topic?
Yeah, mostly I'm just grateful for the responses because, you know, there are things I actually kind of want to write down and like remind myself of. Because I do feel like our workshops were those types of spaces for people, even if the original concept sort of came out of a place of pain. And I think, Kayin, from what you were saying about family cookouts, or like even from the initial question, I was actually thinking about like the experience sometimes of like people like me who grew up in like really white spaces, going back to their like, not there, but going back to Taiwan for me, for instance, and like for the first time being in a space where it's like, oh, I'm just normal. And it's sort of that feeling of like not being other, and like kind of what you're saying, like everyone has the traditions and shares sort of an identity, like eats the same food and loves the same music. And yeah, those are definitely like the spaces of joy that we need to continue creating for ourselves.
Yeah. It's a challenge. I mean, I'm taking all of this as a reminder as well, and as a challenge, like how to do design work, how to do creative work, how to put spaces, products, you know, in non-capitalistic sense, but just like creating what we need in the world together. From that perspective, from that as the starting point, from that as like the way that it should feel to do that work, it's so counter to so much of what we learn and are trained into, right? But it's nourishing, and it's necessary. I'm looking at the clock and I'm seeing that an hour has gone by like that. And so I want to respect everyone's time, but I still want to land on where I think we've kind of ended organically, which is still that note of celebrating and appreciating. And so I want to invite everyone to just share a shout out, an appreciation, a high five, related to this project or not. You know, who would you like to acknowledge and celebrate at this moment, after this conversation, after all the work that we've done together? And it can also be yourself. And so I'm gonna go around randomly, and this time I'm gonna start with Kulsum. Who would you like to celebrate?
Well, I definitely want to give big high fives to Sophia and Karim. You guys did awesome work in the background, and I know it hasn't been easy. You made our jobs a lot easier, so thank you. And I also want to give a shout out to Diana, who's doing our closed captioning. You're doing a phenomenal job. Thank you so much for helping us.
Thank you. I'm gonna embarrass myself and do what I did. Woo! Thank you. Appreciate. Sophia, who would you like to celebrate and appreciate?
I'm just so grateful for all of the artists who joined this project. You've heard about them sort of facilitating our workshops, but really they came on and helped shape the vision and give energy and bring life to this project. So thank you very, very much to the artists on this panel, and also those who are not with us on this panel. So Sol, Brenda, Mohammed, Sarah. I'm just very, very grateful for all of you.
Woo, artists, thank you all. Wendy, how about you? Who would you like to appreciate?
I'd like to appreciate the participants because that was a big stretch to ask. And I think everyone really showed up, and that's really beautiful. And I'd also just like to appreciate everyone in the AAPI community who is really feeling it right now. And we've been going through a lot with this, and just want to give everyone a shout out for just getting out of bed in the morning and doing the thing. Yeah.
Yes, round of applause, appreciation, love, solidarity to all of our siblings. And thank you to our participants as well. And Kayin, who and or what would you like to celebrate or appreciate?
Again, I think everybody's pretty well covered, but I want to appreciate everyone who participated in this project for sure. From you, Karim, and Sophia getting it started and rolling, to those who saw the benefit and the reach that this could have. Then as well as the artists and participants and Kulsum, thank you for creating these spaces and stepping forward with them.
Woo, everyone. Sophia, I think you're last up. Do you want to shout anyone out? Oh, did you shout out already? I'm losing track. There's so many people on this call. Okay, well, then I want to also appreciate everyone who was a part of this event. I want to thank everyone all of you for being on this panel. It was yet another ask, and really grateful for you being in dialogue together here today. And I want to thank also Portland Center Stage for hosting this panel, for making this possible. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in. I have no idea how many people tuned in, but even if you couldn't make it today, hopefully you're watching this at some point in the future. It was recorded and will be on the PCS website. And yeah, just really grateful for everyone for supporting us and making this project happen. With that, we have reached the conclusion of this discussion, but certainly not the end of the conversation. And I'd like to just put an invitation out to anyone watching. If you're interested in the work that Mask Out Hate did, if you're curious about what it would look like to make one of these kinds of workshops happen, you can reach out to us. Mask Out Hate contact info is on our website. We'll be on this event page as well. You can follow on Instagram and follow all of these wonderful artists and facilitators. And there's this really cool photo booth thing that Sophia and Jonas of PCS worked to put together, which you can actually virtually try on the masks that everyone designed. And the link to that is also on the event page. So am I forgetting anything, Sophia? I'm gonna ask, is there anything else that I need to plug?
I think we were going to invite people to join us. If there are people out there that want to just join us for conversation on anything, whether it's the project or this week, I think Jonas will probably drop a link, and we can keep talking.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. We're definitely here to chat with anyone who wants to chat. And I'm going to invite Jonas actually to maybe cue us up on where we should go next. Do we stay on this link? Are we inviting people into this space? But really appreciate everyone for tuning in. Yeah. Thank you. I'm envious of your beautiful skylit space that you're in right now. It looks pretty cool in there. While we're waiting on that, I'd also just invite anyone who was watching, if you have any questions for us, anything that you'd like to ask us, you can, I believe you can drop that into whatever the chat interface is on the platform that you're watching on. And also you'll have the opportunity to ask those questions if you jump into the space with us. But we'd love to answer whatever questions you have. Okay, gotcha. Thank you. Thanks, Jonas.